Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Today, we are going to dive into talking about our point range and whether we can change it or whether we can influence it. And this topic came about because I've been doing a lot of pre-point assessments in the last kind of month or so, and was having a conversation with a dance teacher at one of the studios I was doing pre-point assessments at with regards to a specific dancer and sort of, whether or how to best go about improving that dancer's point range. This is also a question that has come to me. There are people who have sort of written in and requested this podcast topic or something along these similar lines. So it is something that comes up really commonly in the dance world. And even in the clinic, when we talk about goals and what dancers want to work on or improve on, this is something that comes up pretty frequently in terms of like point range or improving their arch, sometimes they'll term it as, or just improving their foot or whatever terminology you want to insert. So we're going to dive into this today, and specifically, can we change it or can we improve it? Because that's really oftentimes ultimately the question that people are asking. First of all, I just want to start off by saying that I think it is important for us to examine why it is that we want to change someone's point range, or why we're looking at trying to improve it. And I say this because in the dance world, it's so easy to get caught up in what the sort of quote unquote ideal aesthetics are. And sometimes when we actually take a step back and look at things, maybe this is not where our time and energy is going to be best spent. That being said, there are absolutely times and instances where looking at somebody's point or point range or whatever you want to call it is going to be beneficial. And so is there a limitation there that is actually going to create difficulties or issues? And this especially comes up with dancers who are looking to progress to doing point work. But this can also apply to people who just want to improve the line or the aesthetic of their foot with other types of dance styles. So when they're not working on point. So there are absolutely instances where this is something that's a really valid area to work on and something we might want to look at improving. But there are also instances where I see a lot of dancers come in, and when we talk about goals, this is one of their top things. Oh, I really want to work on improving my arch. I want to work on my point, all of that type of thing. And when we actually look at their foot, they have a really adequate, or in a lot of cases, even like fantastic foot in terms of the arch. But what they're striving for are these ideals that are perhaps unrealistic and have been maybe artificially sort of inflated in some genres of dance and in some, avenues of social media and things like that, where you get these incredibly bendy feet, super, super high arches, this like sought after, again, quote unquote, ideal. And there's dancers who are striving for that, even though what they have and what they are working with is absolutely adequate. And there are plenty of instances of dancers, professional dancers, very, highly successful dancers who maybe do not have the best point range or the highest arch or the most kind of ideal foot aesthetic. Margot Fontaine is the first one that pops into my brain. Like if you think about or have seen photos of her feet, perhaps they're not considered, that ideal aesthetic for ballet. However, she was a massively successful dancer, and her artistry and her lines and all her other qualities more than made up for what she was potentially lacking in that area. There's lots of other examples, and you can do a quick Google and it'll come up. But even Natalia Osipova is one that, again, when you think about like the people who have those really, really, really high arches, she perhaps did not have that same line, but an absolutely stunning dancer for all of her other qualities. So I just want to say all of that to sort of like hopefully bring things into perspective a little bit, that when we are talking about point range and increasing it or improving our feet or all of those things, we want to make sure that we're coming at it from a lens of, is this something that is actually worth us spending our time and energy on, or are we just getting caught up in unrealistic ideals that perhaps are not necessary for a particular dancer, and maybe their energy and attention could be better spent elsewhere and improving other areas of their dancing? So that is what I'm going to say on that. Now we're going to dive into actually, what can we do about it? Can we change it? Can we improve it? Because like I said, there are instances where this is a very, very valid question. So it really comes down to two main things. Number one, where our limitation is coming from. And then number two, what is causing that limitation. So I'm going to talk about number one first, where the limitation is potentially coming from, but these tie in very, very closely to each other. So in some dancers, when we look at their point range, and so one of the ways we're often assessing this is just dancers sitting on the floor, legs stretched out in front of them, and just, point your feet and seeing where the movement is coming from, where they are potentially limited. We have some dancers who may be limited in the actual ankle joint themselves. So it's the ankle that maybe looks like it doesn't quite get. We often deem that angle there. If they're sort of flat across the front of the ankle, we would call that sort of 180 degrees of plantar flexion or pointing the foot. But when we're looking at pre-point assessments, or sometimes you'll see people refer to what's called the pencil test. And so essentially, if you lay a pencil or a pen or something flat along the front edge of the ankle or the front edge of the leg where it meets the ankle, can we achieve a sort of flat line there, or is there limitation coming from the ankle joint itself? So that's one area where there can be limitation. And then the second area is more coming from either the midfoot or the forefoot. So the ankle itself may have adequate movement in it, but then they don't have as much mobility coming from that sort of midfoot, forefoot area. And this is maybe what we think of more when we talk about high arches or things like that, where there are some people who are naturally going to have much, much higher arches, some people who naturally have a much flatter foot in through that midfoot and forefoot. So when they're pointing their feet, where is that limitation coming from? Because what we are going to do about that, or how we are going to go about addressing that, is a little bit different depending on if it's coming from the ankle or coming more from that mid or forefoot area. So that's the first thing we want to look at and consider to determine, okay, can this dancer potentially improve things, or is this maybe just anatomically how they're built and this is potentially what they're going to be working with. Number two, we're going to think about what is causing that limitation. So in some instances, we'll have more of what we would term a structural limitation. So the design of their bones and their joints and all of that type of thing is set in a certain way. And in other instances, we might have more of what we would deem a soft tissue limitation. And this could be from restriction, so things that are tight or things that have shortened for a specific reason, or it could be more of a functional limitation in terms of how well can we control the muscles that control the movement at the ankle, at the midfoot, at the forefoot, in that whole chain. So knowing where this limitation is anatomically, but then also knowing what is potentially causing the limitation is really important. Because if we have somebody who has a structural limitation, so the way their ankle joint is designed, or the way their midfoot or forefoot is designed, if it is limited in range into plantar flexion and it's fairly fixed in that limitation, and they have more of what we would consider sort of like a rigid or a fixed foot, or it is just simply the shape of their bones, it is unlikely that we are going to significantly change their point range. That is not to say that we aren't going to maybe see some improvements with working on things, but we're probably not going to take a dancer who has that sort of structural limitation and all of a sudden, improve their point range by like 20 degrees or 30 degrees or something super, super drastic. Because it is the way they are designed, it is the structure of their foot, and we don't want to be messing with the anatomical structure of people's body parts, but especially our feet. So if we know that this limitation is more structural, there's not as much that we can do. That doesn't mean there's nothing that we can do. We can still work on enhancing what they do have available to them, but there is less that we can do. If the limitation is coming more from soft tissue structures, there's a lot we can do in terms of improving a dancer's point range. So when I get asked this question, and especially if it's a dance teacher asking this question about a dancer that I may not know, or like a dancer I haven't assessed and worked with, like I'm doing a pre-point assessment in a group class, and so I've seen them moving and functioning, but I haven't actually been able to like put my hands on and assess where the limitations are coming from. It is a very hard question to answer because it's not as simple as being like, can people improve their point or can they not improve their point? Generally, the answer is going to be yes, but the degree with which we can see improvements is going to depend on what some of these limiting factors are. And so we really do want to have dancers, if we have a dancer who we have any concerns about this type of thing, we do want to have those dancers assessed ideally by somebody who understands dance and the demands of dance and what the desired aesthetic is that dancers are going after, so that they can give you more detailed and more nuanced information about where those limitations are coming from and whether we can address them and how we're going to best go about addressing them. So it's not quite as simple as just being like, yes, everybody can improve their point range. Most people probably can to a certain degree, but some people are going to be able to more so than others based on what their anatomical structure is like. Now, for the people where it is potentially more soft tissue that is limiting the mobility or the range of their point, these people are the people where we're going to have a ton of success. And we see like often quite dramatic results with people who have soft tissue limitations and working on improving these. These soft tissue limitations can affect the ankle joint itself, or they can affect the midfoot and forefoot area. So again, we were talking before about knowing where the limitation is actually coming from. If it is a soft tissue limitation, it can affect any of those areas, and oftentimes it will potentially affect both of those areas because a lot of the extrinsic muscles of the foot, so these are muscles that control the foot and help our feet function, but they don't originate in the feet. They originate in the lower leg area. So we call them extrinsic because they're kind of external to the foot and then they end in the foot. We also have intrinsic muscles that start and end in the foot. The extrinsic muscles start in the lower leg, and so they cross the ankle joint and then come into the foot. And so if these muscles are at all impacted, then they will often affect the ankle and the foot function. And so again, addressing these and whether it is a limitation in terms of a tightness or a shortening that's happening. And we see this commonly, especially in dancers who, when they point their feet, tend to be toe grippers. So they're really, really, really using their toes to try and get every last ounce out of their point. they're sometimes actually not doing themselves any favors by doing that, because if they're really actively overusing those toe flexor muscles, sometimes that creates a lot of unnecessary tension and restriction in those long toe flexor muscles. And because that muscle is one of the ones that starts in the lower leg and then crosses the ankle and goes into the foot, it can create a lot of tension that limits the mobility in through the ankle and in through that midfoot, forefoot area. So knowing what's limiting and where it's coming from, we can then work on releasing and lengthening those muscles. And often that will have a very dramatic effect on somebody's point range and their ability to actually access the mobility that they may have in their feet. And these are people sometimes, not always, but oftentimes these are dancers who are like, I can use my hands and sort of like press my feet or mold my feet, and I can like point my foot, but I can't actually hold my feet in this position, or it just feels like there's so much resistance. So when I try and point my foot, it feels like it gets stuck or it feels like it gets blocked and they can't access it. But they know that there's more mobility there because passively, if they're just, using their hands to move their feet around, or maybe a teacher is like helping them or that type of thing, they know that there's more mobility available in their foot. And so in these dancers, we are going to figure out where the limitation's coming from or the restriction, and then work on releasing and lengthening those muscles as needed. So that's going to be one type of person where sometimes that's all that's needed. So that might be the thing that's holding them back and that's like preventing them from achieving the point range that they're after, is that restriction in terms of muscle tension or muscle tightness in through there. In a lot of other cases, we actually have dancers who maybe tightness or restriction is not so much the issue, but they may not have great control of the muscles that actually help to support the foot or help to create the arches in the foot and create that nice kind of articulation and smooth line from that, especially that midfoot, forefoot area. And so oftentimes this is those intrinsic muscles I was just referring to. So those little ones that kind of start and end in the foot. If we don't have good control of those intrinsic muscles, then as a dancer is going to point their foot, they're not actually using the full mobility that they have available to them. So they may have that mobility available, but they can't access it. So it could be a muscle recruitment issue in the sense that they are just not necessarily sure which muscles to use. The feet are really kind of complex sometimes because there's so many tiny muscles in our feet that sometimes we haven't learned how to access specific groups of muscles, and so we tend to overuse some groups and underuse other groups. Or more often than not, it's just a pure weakness issue that we see. So we, as a society, tend to wear shoes the vast majority of the time. We often wear shoes that are fairly narrow or don't allow our feet to function in a way that allows our toes to splay and our feet to ground themselves on the ground. There is a bit of a trend towards people wearing more natural or barefoot style footwear that allows this a little bit more. But regardless, we are often in shoes for large portions of the day. If we are in dance shoes especially, they tend to be very narrow and very constricting or restrictive. And so a lot of times those small intrinsic muscles in our feet just get weak because we don't use them. We don't spend very much time in bare feet running around doing things where we would be developing those muscles. And so for a lot of people, and this isn't just dancers, we see this in just general population because, again, societally, we tend to wear footwear most of the time. Oftentimes people are weak in those intrinsic muscles. And so working on strengthening those muscles will actually help to create more of an arch in the foot and be able to support the foot so that when we point the foot, we can actually kind of improve the range or improve the aesthetic, I guess, of the foot. The range is probably already there, but we're just not able to access it. And so we can see that people can improve that through improving the function. The external muscles of the feet also help. So some of those ones are really big stabilizers of the arches of our feet as well. And we do see weakness in those muscles sometimes as well. And so again, we want to, on an individual basis, be able to assess and figure out, okay, what muscle groups are the ones that this particular dancer needs to focus on or work on. So it's not just as simple as being like every dancer can do like this exercise and it's going to improve their point range. I see so many dancers, and it's not their fault. It's just what you see, online and all over the place. You see so many dancers just working on pointing and flexing their foot using a TheraBand. And that's kind of the only exercise that they might be doing. And they're like, I've been doing this for a year and I don't really feel like my point range is improving. And more often than not, that might just not be the most effective exercise, because it could be something else that's limiting them, or it's often more specific, like intrinsic muscle groups that need to work on strengthening in order for you to be able to access the point range that might be there. So it is a little bit more of a nuanced, complex issue, and oftentimes does require individual assessment to figure out where the limitations are coming from, because unfortunately, it is not sort of a one-size-fits-all. It would be really easy if we just could say, okay, everybody who's a bit limited in their point range, do these 3 exercises and everybody will improve. But unfortunately, it's not quite that straightforward, because like you've heard, we need to know where the limitation is coming from, and then we need to know what is causing that limitation. Is it more structural, or bones or that type of thing, or is it more of a functional limitation that potentially we can actually really work on improving? I will just wrap up by saying it is far less common to see true structural limitations in dancers. That is not to say it does not happen. I absolutely have worked with dancers who do have structural limitations and just have to learn how to maximize what they have available and potentially then work on other aspects of their dancing, in the sense that, okay, if your feet aren't going to be the thing that makes you stand out from the crowd, what is that thing going to be? Are we going to work on your musicality? Are we going to work on your artistry? Is it going to be your arms? Is it going to be your lines? Is it going to be whatever? The list goes on and on and on. For some dancers, their feet are maybe just not going to be the thing that makes them stand out. And I think if we can accept that and realize that, and that's not to say we're not going to try and maximize what is available, but at some point there is no real benefit in continuing to obsess about something that's probably not going to get significantly better. And all of that energy could be spent on other areas of their dance where they really can, excel and stand out and put their energy into that. So with some dancers, we do need to have that conversation and say, do you know what? This is maybe as good as it's going to get for now, but let's focus on other areas of your dancing that you have more control over. That being said, it is not as common to see dancers who have true structural limitations. More often than not, I would say I see dancers in the clinic who have these functional limitations. And if we can figure out what it is that's limiting it and then retrain how the dancers are utilizing their feet, and so address those restrictions and work on muscle recruitment and strengthening, more often than not, we really can improve a dancer's point range. So I think there are some dancers who just are kind of like, oh, this is just what my feet, I have quote unquote bad feet. We hear that all of the time. And dancers come in and they're like a bit dejected and they're just like, oh, I have bad feet. They're never going to get any better. But more often than not, there are things that we can work on to improve them. So as much as there are people who do have true structural limitations, I would say I don't see that as commonly as I see dancers who absolutely can improve their point range by working on some of the functional aspects of things. Are you going to have the most bendy banana feet in the world? No, probably not. The people who have those feet are generally born with those feet. So when we see things, especially on social media, the accounts that really drive me up the wall are accounts where there's somebody who just has, the most, the highest arch, the most natural point, a true kind of banana foot. And they're like, do these 3 exercises to have feet like me. And it just kind of drives me crazy, because those 3 exercises are not why their feet look like that. Their feet look like that because of genetics. And they're just, using the natural shape of their foot to promote whatever it is that they're promoting. And so you definitely have to kind of view some of those things with like a little bit of skepticism sometimes, because the people who have the most naturally kind of like bendy, super high arched feet, generally it is going to be genetic. They are usually born like that. And again, it's not to say we can't improve other people's feet, but those feet are not necessarily what every dancer should be striving to achieve, is I suppose the point I'm getting to. There's a whole host of other challenges that come with those feet, and I actually may do a whole separate podcast episode, because everybody wants to have that super banana foot, but realistically, the dancers who have them, they really, really struggle to be able to control and strengthen and like learn how to utilize feet like that. It's a lot of work. So it is not always the kind of blessing that everybody thinks it is. Sometimes it actually can be more frustrating than anything. So I will save that for another podcast episode, but I did just want to say that because even when we're talking about improving point range, we are usually not, going to improve it to the point that you're going to have the most bendy foot in the entire world. So that's not to say that we're not going to improve people's feet, because absolutely we are, but we also need to be realistic about where we're starting from and what we're working with, so that dancers have realistic goals of what they're working towards and not sort of false ideals of what may be not possible for them to achieve. All right. That is what I'm going to say about this episode. I also just really quickly, I'm going to mention that way, way, way back when, and I don't remember what podcast episode number it is, but I will link it in the show notes. I did an episode on foot stretchers, because that is a question that I often get when we're talking about improving point range, more often from parents than from anyone else, where they're like, oh, well, should we go out and buy one of those foot stretchers for my dancer to use? So I did do an entire podcast episode on foot stretchers that covers, it's a bit different to the information in here, but if you're curious about foot stretchers, I will link that. Go have a listen to that podcast episode as well. So I will just leave that there, and that's all I'm going to say about foot stretchers. So I'm going to wrap things up. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is in the show notes, or you can reach out to me on social media at Dance Physio Erika. Erika is with a K, and make sure you are following me on social media, especially Instagram. That is where I am most active. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.